In the previous panel, we looked at the first of two options presented by the Shulchan Aruch Harav with respect to BIRCHAT HaTORAH. That first option maintained that BIRCHAT HaTORAH comes as a bracha over the mitzvah of limud Torah, similar to the bracha that is cited over the talit and the tefillin. Two opinions were presented as to whether there is an obligation, a requirement, as with the case of talit and tefillin, to immediately perform the mitzvah, so too with respect to a requirement to actually begin some Torah study following the bracha. For this, the Tosfot of the Mordechai argued that there is no requirement to begin some Torah study, while the Rosh and the Tur disagree. And on that basis, the Shulchan Aruch Harav notes that Minhag Yisrael is to insert two pieces of Torah text, one from the Torah Shebiktav, that's Birchat Kohanim, the other from the Torah Shebal Peh, the Mishnah of Elot Dvarim She'en Lahem Shiur. The thesis underpinning the Tosfot of the Mordechai is that the obligation for Limud HaTorah is a 24-hour obligation, and hence the issue of a hefsek, an interference, a gap between the bracha and its implementation, does not exist. This, in contrast to mitzvot in general, they are a one-time event. Once the event has taken place, there is no longer an obligation to fulfill that particular mitzvah. Therefore, the fulfillment of the mitzvah must follow immediately after the recitation of the bracha, to link the bracha to the mitzvah. What is unclear and needs explanation is the position of the Rosh and the Tur, who maintain that one is required to begin Limud HaTorah immediately after the bracha. What would be their position regarding the mitzvah of Limud HaTorah as a 24-hour-a-day mitzvah? As we shall see from a footnote, the Rebbe's view is that they agree with the Tosfot of the Mordechai. The Shulchan Aruch Harav also offers a second option, one proposed by the Sefer HaGur, who writes the Vayesh Omrim, Birchat HaTorah hi kebirchat HaShachar. Birchat HaTorah is part of Birchat HaShachar, which are a set of brachot acknowledging God's positive influence in day-to-day living, such as the fact that we can see, the fact that we can hear, the fact that we have been selected to observe his mitzvot, embedded in the brachot of Shelo Asani Goy, Shelo Asani Aved, Shelo Asani Isha. And as one of the Birchat HaShachar, Shelo Tiknu Otan Elapam Achat Bayom. These set of brachot, unlike the brachot that are recited over food, these brachot are said only one time each day. So that even if after one's learning one is mafsik by, for example, sleeping, going to work, doing other things, when the individual returns to Limud HaTorah, Ein Tzarich Lachazor Ulevarech. The position of the Hagur, as quoted in the Shulchan Aruch Harav, is that one is not required to then recite a second bracha over Limud Torah, and V'chein Nahagu. This is normative halacha. In other words, according to the Sefer HaAgur, and quoted by the Magen Avraham, the recitation of Birchat HaTorah is part of Birchat HaShachar and technically would not require an actual session of learning immediately following the bracha. What we now have are the two positions. Option 1A, that of the Tosfot and the Mordechai. Option 1B from the Rosh and the Tur, both maintaining that Birchat HaShachar is a bracha recited over the mitzvah of Limud HaTorah, and the Sefer HaAgur, option 2, that Birchat HaTorah is not the bracha of the actual mitzvah, but rather has been included as part of the Birchat HaShachar. And while the Tosfot and the Mordechai clearly subscribe to the position that the mitzvah of Limud HaTorah is a 24-hour-a-day mitzvah, and therefore there is no issue of a hefsek and a repeat bracha every time one sits down to study Torah, it might be argued that the option 2 of the Sefer HaGur that places the Birchat HaTorah as part of the Birchot HaShachar, they may not possibly subscribe to the 24-hour theory with respect to Limud HaTorah, especially in light of the fact that the Shulchan Aruch Harav notes that option 2 is normative halacha, v'chein nahagu. This is Minhag Yisrael. And similarly with option 1B, that of the Rosh and the Tur, who maintain that one is required to activate Limud HaTorah following the recitation of the bracha, and who, in the words of the Shulchan Aruch Harav, v'yesh cholkim al zeh, in other words, they disagree. Therefore, v'nachon lachush l'divreihem, one needs to take option 1B into consideration, and therefore we do recite pieces of Torah as part of actual learning. It might be suggested that they also do not subscribe to the concept that the mitzvah of Limud HaTorah is a 24-hour mitzvah. In footnote number 7, the Rebbe argues that option 1 from the Tosfot of the Mordechai, option 1b from the Rosh and the Tur, and option 2 from the Sefer HaGur can all subscribe to the thesis that mitzvah to Talmud Torah is a 24-hour-a-day mitzvah. The point of disagreement is over the issue of a hefsek, when one stops one's learning temporarily or for an extended period of time, whether or not one is required, as with the brachot recited over food items, should one also be required to recite a new bracha for a subsequent session of limud Torah. In the words of the footnote, v'hamachloket ben beit hadayot, the machlok between the two positions, hu rak im tzarich levarech od ha'pa'am, whether or not one is required to recite another bracha, k'shemasiach da'ato, when one's concentration moves away from the study of Torah and one focuses upon other matters, such as the family or spending 6 to 8 hours in the work environment. Aval l'divrei hakol, but according to all 2 or 3 opinions, eino kashur, their disagreement is not linked lahit chalkut, the yom v'layla, as to whether or not, as is the case with Kriyat Shema, that there is a nighttime and a daytime mitzvah with respect to limud Torah, and therefore, according to option 1b, the Rosh and the Tur, and the Sefer HaGur, they also will ultimately maintain that the mitzvah of Talmud Torah at its core is a 24-hour mitzvah.